show. We are so glad you're joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, if you are the kind of curious learner who looks past the immediate headlines to really, understand the underlying geopolitical currents, you are in the exact right
You
place.
really are. Because today's topic is, well, it's a dense.
It's very dense. Today, we're looking at a deeply complex situation unfolding in South Sudan. And I mean, it's a striking paradox, right? This is the world's youngest country. It was born out of massive international optimism back in 2011.
Right.
But today, just over a decade later, we're examining a nation that is really teetering on the edge, experiencing a simultaneous multi-front fracture.
Yeah, the contrast between that foundational hope of 2011 and the current security reality is severe. We're not just, analyzing abstract political shifts today. We are looking at a series of acute, overlapping crises.
Hmm.
Crises that really demonstrate what happens when a state's monopoly on violence just begins to completely dissolve across distinct geographic fault lines.
Exactly. And to understand the mechanics of that dissolution, we have laid out two urgent breaking news reports for our deep dive today. We're drawing from the BBC and Radio Tamazouj.
Two very solid sources on the ground.
Right. And our mission today is to unpack this sudden, multi-layered surge of violence in South Sudan. We're going to break down what is happening on the ground, the staggering human cost, and why the international community is suddenly sounding the alarm.
It is a vital mission for us because the core theme emerging from these sources is that viewing these events as just isolated, localized skirmishes is a fundamental analytical error.
Right. It's bigger than that.
Much bigger. What we are witnessing are the aggressive symptoms of a stalled national political transition. It's a structural failure that really has the potential to drag the entire region back into widespread conflict if these underlying power struggles aren't resolved.
Okay, let's unpack this. We need to begin with the first major strategic failure reported by the BBC, which took place in the Ruweng administrative area in the north of the country.
Right up near the border.
Exactly. And the timeline here is critical. It is Sunday, 4:23 in the morning local time. That's 02:30 GMT. We are in Abiamnam County. At this hour, people are sleeping.
Right. There's no active alert.
Done. And then a massive coordinated assault breaches the area. The BBC reports that dozens of unidentified armed youth launched a surprise attack, and they completely overran the stationed government forces.
The element of surprise at that hour points to a catastrophic intelligence failure by the local security apparatus. I mean, you do not move dozens of armed combatants into position for a pre-dawn raid without significant logistical coordination.
You really don't.
The fact that local government forces were completely outnumbered and outmaneuvered from the very first shot, it indicates this was a highly planned offensive, not just a spontaneous clash.
Yeah, and the BBC report backs up that assessment of a coordinated offensive through the sheer duration and scale of the destruction. For 3 to 4 hours, the attackers had effective control of the area.
3 to 4 hours is an eternity in a firefight.
It's an absolute eternity. They systematically set fire to homes and local markets. We're looking at a deliberate campaign to destroy the economic and social infrastructure of the county. And the casualty numbers, well, the numbers provided by the local information minister, James Maniluwak Mijok, are just staggering.
They are.
The death toll currently stands at 178 people. Now, an anonymous diplomatic source who spoke to the AFP news agency put their initial estimate at 70, but they explicitly noted they expected that number to rise as the area was cleared.
What's fascinating here is when you analyze the breakdown of that 178 figure provided by Minister Mijok, it reveals the true tactical nature of the assault.
How so?
Well, out of those 178 casualties, 90 were children, women, and the elderly.
Wow.
Yeah. This indicates a deliberate targeting of the community's most vulnerable demographic. It turns this from a military engagement into an asymmetric massacre.
Which completely shifts the nature of the attack. It's not just two armed factions engaging one another in the bush, but the remaining casualties also tell a critical story about the collapse of local governance.
Precisely. Because the remaining 79 victims were members of regional forces and the police.
Right.
So the local security infrastructure was systematically decimated. Furthermore, the attackers executed a localized decapitation strike on the civilian leadership. Several senior officials were killed, including the county commissioner and the executive director.
So they neutralized both the civilian population and the structural leadership of the entire county in just a matter of hours.
Exactly. And the reality, according to the local minister, is that many of these victims have now been buried in a mass grave. which is the ultimate indicator of an infrastructure so completely overwhelmed that it cannot even process its own debt.
That is just bleak, and that profound systemic overwhelm extends directly to the medical response, which is the next critical layer of this crisis that we need to look at.
The medical front line is where the true cost of this is being paid.
Absolutely, because once government forces finally managed to regain control, the immediate aftermath presented an impossible logistical nightmare. The BBC reports that 73 people required emergency hospitalization, but the local facilities in Ruweng were entirely insufficient for that.
They just couldn't handle it.
Right, so many of these severe trauma patients had to be evacuated out of the Ruweng administrative area entirely. They were transported to the neighboring Abai administrative area just to receive basic stabilization and treatment.
Transferring over 70 critical trauma patients across administrative borders in a volatile security environment is a monumental risk. It tells you that the local medical infrastructure in Ruweng was either physically compromised by the attack or simply lacked the baseline capacity to handle a mass casualty event of this magnitude.
And we get a very clear picture of what that capacity strain looked like on the receiving end in Abyei. The BBC piece includes a really powerful account from the medical charity Médecins Sans Frontières, or MSF.
MSF does incredible work in these zones.
They really do. And there was an MSF nurse supervisor named Abraham Deng Luolwek, and he described an absolute deluge of severe casualties. The volume of incoming trauma was so high that medical staff from the Ministry of Health and other regional facilities were rushing in on their days off to assist the MSF team.
The logistics of trauma surgery in a resource-deprived environment are just unforgiving. When you have a sudden influx of ballistic and burn injuries, the medical protocol requires ruthless triage.
Right.
You're constantly calculating survivability against rapidly depleting supplies of blood, anesthesia, and sterile equipment.
And Nurse Weck's account highlights exactly how tight that bottleneck was. I want you, the listener, to try and picture this scene. Imagine a local hospital suddenly hit with over 70 severe trauma patients at once.
It's chaos.
Absolute chaos. He noted that it was a massive challenge for the surgical team because they only had 2 operating theaters. 2 theaters to manage 73 victims of a sustained armed assault. The triage area, the emergency room, and all the standard wards reached absolute maximum capacity almost immediately.
When your hard infrastructure fails like that, you have to improvise, which inevitably degrades the standard of care, despite the heroic efforts of the medical staff on the ground.
And that improvisation meant the MSF team literally had to start pitching tents. They took over a separate meeting space just to expand their physical footprint. Try to imagine the sheer adrenaline and the exhaustion of those medical workers.
It's hard to even fathom.
They were forced to run an active mass casualty protocol, cycling critical patients through just 2 operating theaters, while simultaneously managing dozens of stabilizing patients in temporary canvas structures outside. It is a vivid demonstration of how quickly a localized conflict stretches the international humanitarian safety net to its absolute breaking point.
And while the humanitarian sector is stretched to the breaking point dealing with the physical fallout, the political sector is rapidly fracturing over the narrative of the attack.
Yes, the blame game.
Right. The assignment of blame in the immediate aftermath of an event like this is often just as volatile as the attack itself.
Let's look at exactly how those political fault lines are rupturing right now. Local Information Minister Myok did not hesitate to point fingers. He alleges that these armed youth originated from the neighboring Unity state. Crucially, he claims they are directly linked to the SPLA-IO. That's the Sudan People's Liberation Army in opposition.
Right, the primary opposition force.
Exactly. And Mijok escalated the geopolitical stakes by further claiming that officials in Unity State must have had knowledge of the impending assault on Ruweng.
To understand the political fracture here, we really have to look at these conflicting narratives objectively. We have to analyze the claims exactly as they exist in the reporting to understand the broader instability.
And just to be completely clear to you listening, we are absolutely not taking a side here. We are not endorsing any of these political viewpoints. We are simply reporting the conflicting claims as they are laid out in the sources so you can see the friction for yourself.
Exactly. Strict impartiality is crucial here. So, looking at the other side, the SPLA-IO has categorically denied any involvement in the Ruweng attack. They have aggressively pushed back, accusing the local authorities of manufacturing a political crisis and utilizing the violence to further their own regional agendas.
And what about Unity State?
Well, meanwhile, Unity State authorities have remained silent. They've issued no formal response to Mijok's accusations.
So we have a local government officially accusing a national opposition army of orchestrating a massacre. We have an opposition army accusing the local government of exploiting a tragedy. And we have a neighboring state government refusing to engage at all.
It is a complete collapse of a unified national narrative.
Yeah.
If we zoom out and connect this to the bigger picture, you can see why this specific blame game is so incredibly dangerous.
How so?
South Sudan's modern history has been defined by extreme poverty, deep-seated corruption, and brutal civil conflict. The current political framework rests heavily on a 2018 power-sharing agreement between President Salva Kiir and his primary rival, Riek Machar. This agreement was fundamentally a ceasefire. It was built on the promise of integrating these opposing factions into a single, unified national army.
But the BBC reporting notes that over the past year, that 2018 power-sharing deal has steadily unraveled.
It has unraveled precisely because that military integration has stalled. Disputes over command structures, resource allocation, and territorial control have left heavily armed loyalist factions operating in parallel rather than as a cohesive state security apparatus.
So they're basically acting like independent armies again.
Exactly. And because of this structural failure, the United Nations is now actively warning that the country is at risk of sliding backward into all-out civil war. When the national power-sharing structure loses credibility, local actors often begin preemptively arming and striking out of self-preservation.
That makes sense.
A localized dispute over resources or territory, like we see in the oil-rich regions of the North, quickly gets mapped onto national political divisions.
But here's where it gets really interesting, though. The collapse of security isn't just a domestic issue confined to local militias and government forces anymore. When the internal state apparatus fails, the international safety net usually steps in to maintain baseline stability.
Right, the peacekeepers and aid workers.
Exactly. But our second source from Radio Tamazouj reveals that the international safety net is now actively being targeted.
This represents a massive escalation in the threat matrix. When international mechanisms designed strictly for peacekeeping and infrastructure development become targets, the fundamental rules and engagement that govern conflict zones are entirely eroded.
Radio Tamazouj details a completely separate incident that occurred on that exact same Sunday. This was hundreds of miles away from Ruweng. This took place along the border between Jonglei State and the Greater Piber Administrative Area.
Another highly volatile region.
Yes. A United Nations mission in South Sudan, UNMIS engineering contingent, was traveling in a convoy from Akobo down to Pibor. Now, these are engineers. Their primary mandate is infrastructure repair and development, though they do travel with an escort of military peacekeepers due to the volatile environment.
Moving an engineering convoy through Jonglei State requires navigating a deeply fragmented landscape of local militias and armed factions. The presence of armed UN peacekeepers is a standard deterrent, sure, but it also makes the convoy a highly visible representative of international authority.
And that authority was directly challenged. The Radio Tamazouj report states the UN convoy was suddenly halted at an unauthorized roadblock. They were then fired upon by unidentified armed men.
A direct ambush on a UN convoy.
Yes. The situation escalated to the point where the UN peacekeepers were forced to return fire in self-defense. A tactical response, which the UN mission explicitly noted, was fully in line with their mandate and established rules of engagement.
Which is an important distinction to make.
Very important. And thankfully, no UN personnel were injured in this specific exchange. But the diplomatic threshold that was crossed is highly significant.
The legal implications of engaging a UN convoy are severe. Anita Kiki Kabeho, the officer in charge of UNMASS, issued a very sharp statement following the ambush.
What did she say?
She reiterated that any attack against peacekeepers is fundamentally unacceptable. But more importantly, she explicitly warned that targeting UN personnel may constitute a war crime under international law.
Wow.
She's demanding a swift, impartial investigation and calling for immediate accountability. Though, as of the reporting, no faction has claimed responsibility for the roadblock.
So on one front, you have UN engineers being ambushed at illegal checkpoints.
Yeah.
But the erosion of safe spaces gets even darker when we look at the parallel humanitarian crisis.
The aid workers.
Right. Returning to the BBC source, the reporting highlights a terrifying deterioration of security for MSF workers, specifically in Jonglei State, which, remember, is the exact same region where that UN convoy began its journey.
Jonglei has been the site of escalating multifactional violence for weeks now, primarily between government forces and various opposition groups. It's an environment where the distinction between combatant and civilian infrastructure is rapidly fading.
Fading completely. The BBC reports that because of this escalating violence, 26 MSF staff members have gone missing in Jonglei.
26 people.
We are talking about 26 medical professionals who are completely unaccounted for in an active conflict zone. Consequently, the medical charity has been forced to completely suspend its operations in two crucial parts of the state, Lankin and Pieri.
The cascading effects of an MSF withdrawal are immediate. When a primary medical provider suspends operations in a region like Jonglei, thousands of vulnerable civilians lose access to life-saving care overnight.
People who have nothing to do with the fighting.
Exactly. Preventable diseases, maternal complications, trauma wounds, they all go entirely untreated. The withdrawal of international aid doesn't just pause relief, it actively accelerates the mortality rate of the surrounding population.
But the detail from the BBC report that truly underscores the severity of this collapse is the specific reason MSF had to suspend operations in Lankin. It wasn't just ambient factional violence making the roads unsafe.
No.
The MSF medical facility in Lankin was directly hit by a government airstrike on February 3rd.
An airstrike. A sovereign government launching an airstrike on an internationally recognized medical humanitarian facility is a profound violation of international humanitarian law.
It's hard to comprehend.
It suggests a complete breakdown of command and control, or worse, a chilling disregard for the protected status of medical operations.
The MSF statement paints a grim picture of the aftermath. Following the airstrike, their surviving staff were forced to flee into the surrounding bush alongside their own families.
We became refugees themselves.
Exactly. These doctors and nurses are now internally displaced persons themselves, sheltering in remote areas with virtually no access to food, water, or basic survival services. The very individuals deployed to provide aid are now the ones desperately requiring it.
It perfectly illustrates the total collapse of operational safe spaces within the country. When hospitals are forced into tents, when UN engineering convoys are ambushed at roadblocks, and when medical clinics are targeted by state airstrikes, the fundamental architecture of international support is paralyzed.
So what does this all mean when we synthesize these disparate events?
It's a heavy picture.
It is. We are looking at a country where, right now, approximately 1,000 civilians are sheltering near a UN base in Ruweng, terrified of a secondary assault following the massacre of 178 people. We're observing a political transition that has critically stalled, allowing a vital 2018 power-sharing agreement to unravel into competing local and national proxy conflicts.
Yeah.
We have a fragmented map where armed violence is escalating simultaneously across entirely different regions, from Ruweng in the north to Jonglei and Paibor in the east. And we are witnessing an agonizing humanitarian crisis where the infrastructure of aid is literally being bombed from the sky.
This raises an important question for anyone analyzing global security today. Why does the stabilization of South Sudan matter to the broader international community?
Right. Why should the rest of the world care?
The answer is that South Sudan is currently serving as a real-time, high-stakes case study in state failure. It demonstrates exactly what happens when international law is tested by militant groups and when national power-sharing structures fail to integrate competing armies.
It really is a stark reminder.
It's a reminder of how rapidly a nation can fragment into balkanized warring territories, even with a massive, multi-billion-dollar international peacekeeping apparatus actively attempting to hold the state together.
It forces us to examine the very limits of international intervention. Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with today, something for you to mull over as you synthesize everything we've covered in this deep dive.
Yeah.
We've seen that the very people trying to build the country's infrastructure, like the UN engineering convoy, and the people trying to heal its citizens, like the MSF nurses, are being forced to flee or fight for their lives. If this trajectory continues and the violence forces these international organizations to systematically withdraw their personnel and funding from South Sudan, what exactly fills that massive vacuum?
That is the big question.
Does the country succumb to total internal collapse, or do regional powers step in to exploit the void, turning South Sudan into an even larger theater for proxy warfare? It makes you wonder, how can a fragile young nation ever hope to finish building itself when the builders and the healers are the ones under fire?
It is the ultimate geopolitical unknown. When the architects of stability are forced to evacuate, the actors who replace them rarely have peace as their primary objective.
A very sobering reality to consider as we watch these events unfold. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We really appreciate your intellectual curiosity, we value your time, and we encourage you to keep questioning the deeper currents driving the headlines. We will catch you next time.